Panel, just listen to the language that Vishwa uses in his first argument, that in their world, there will be no difference between you and your neighbor. They never substantiate why that's a good thing. On our side, Eugene and I actually argue there's immense value to using material goods to feel special. There is immense value to having a certain sense of specialty revolving around the goods that you do have instead of just producing everything willy-nilly. I'm going to talk about a few points of clash, then introduce a third argument on the value of control of production. Okay, in terms of clash, the first thing I want to bring back is what Eugene told you in his first speech, which is that this technology is likely to be weaponized by different individuals, for instance, to produce en masse weapons or illicit substances. All they say on their side is, first of all, that this isn't in the spirit of the motion. I implore you to look at the actual wording of the motion. It literally just says users can generate whatever product they want in a post-scarcity society, which indicates as long as these weapons of mass destruction, for instance, have already been created and invented by humanity, we are able to say people can weaponize that and just create more of those on our side. But the more promising response that they give is that since we can already have created these technologies in the first place, we presumably also have the technology to regulate the production. They give no mechanism for this. I want to just point out, the reason you can regulate in the status quo, whether or not someone can, for instance, get an atomic bomb, is because you can cut them off in the chain of supply. So for instance, the United States can cut off Iran's enriched uranium plants and stop them from gaining an atomic weapon because they can stop them in the process of supply. On their side, you have unpredictable things where you just, in a snap of a finger, reproduce a certain material. It is an unrelentlessly accelerated version of production. It's fast, and they give no mechanism for how you can even regulate anything on their side of the house. I want to now talk, though, about the other point that Vishwa gives you toward the last minute of the speech that he just kind of throws out, which is that individuals on their side are less basically on the hedonistic treadmill of consumerism. Therefore, they look towards intrinsic forms of success and happiness instead of just relying on the drive to pursue material goods. Two observations here. First of all, we already pointed out that the worst forms of capitalism, for instance, exist when big businessmen preclude poor communities, for instance, from achieving the goals that they need for survival. So for instance, blocking off people's access to water or limited resources for food and agrarian farmland. In a post-scarce society, which by the way exists on either side of the house, we already mitigate significantly the harms of that. So for instance, you already have access to food, water, and resources that are essential to survival. Those are available on either side of the house. They cannot just claim the worst impacts that could ever happen. But the second thing I want to note is the motion says that this debate takes place in literally the 24th century. Just think about how, now that we're in the 21st century, how far since the last 3 centuries, since the 18th century we've come. We've literally gone from having horse-drawn carriages on dirt roads and dumping sewage into random rivers to harvesting literal solar energy and running self-driving cars. Give us another 3 centuries, coupled with the already accelerating rate of innovation, and we think already the negative impacts of materialistic demands, consumerism, and capitalism are heavily mitigated insofar as people aren't going to be reduced to like working in factories, etc. They're working in like maintenance jobs, etc. That's the frame we already kind of implied in first that they needed to adapt their case to, which didn't actually happen on their side of the house. But then the other argument that Vishwa throws out in the last minute of his speech is one about monopolies, that basically people still want to compete for resources and that on their side of the house, they somehow stop people from having like that manifest in a horrible way. I would posit that this actually arguably gets worse on their side. The reason is that if everyone perceives that there's a threat of anyone just coming in and replicating the very little resources that you do have, for instance, in your little planet or so, they're going to try their best to hog what little inventions or innovations they do have. So if I have, for instance, a really cool technology like a computer, for instance, I'm going to try to monopolize that even harder. So for instance, another planet also in the Federation of Planets cannot just come in and replicate it for their own economic gain. That is the point at which these tensions that they point out exist on our side just get all the more worse on their side. I now want to talk, though, about a third argument for our side of the house on the value of control. And we think, actually, that there's immense value in not just being able to replicate whatever product our heart desires, whenever our heart desires to replicate that product. I'm going to have 3 layers of analysis here. And the third layer of analysis is also going to directly engage with Vishwa's point on consumerism. The first layer of analysis is in terms of environmental harms, because we think when it becomes so unbelievably easy and effortless to come into possession of a product, we have way less of an appreciation of each individual one of those products. There's something psychological about us that then stimulates us to excessively easily produce these products. So therefore, we're far more likely to exorbitantly summon these products en masse at the point at which you can just, in a snap of a finger, automatically replicate that product. This is, for instance, why in the status quo, absent the existence of this technology, it's easier for us to take napkins from a hotel buffet than it is to take it from a family pantry. It's just, we have to go through less psychological loopholes in order to take it from the buffet. Therefore, we're more likely to extract absorbently. But here's the problem. On their side of the house, they have so many expendable products that people might just get things for the fun of it, just because they have access to this technology. So you can make like random gadgets and toys, etc. Once you then discard of those things, then you create a far more polluted world insofar as you just have like more machinery just floating around in random intergalactic places. And no, maybe, perhaps we are in a post-scarcity world, but it's still just objectively less enjoyable to have a bunch of pollution floating around the galaxy that you live in, especially because this is likely to harm vulnerable communities who are going to be forced to deal with the negative effects of this pollution, or be forced to contend with actually dealing with sanitation, etc. I would draw an analogy to the status quo. I'll take you in a moment, where, for instance, people in Bangalore of India are forced to deal with most of the Earth's pollution when India's trash, for instance, and plastic trash goes into the rivers, because it's always the most vulnerable groups that are used as a dumping ground. They're the ones that have to deal with all your harms. Waiting on their side of the house, while galactic tycoons and overlords indulge in consumerism, get fancy gadgets and machinery, everyone else has to contend with a world in which there's just objectively more materialistic products floating around and making life worse for everyone else. The second layer of analysis, though, is on a psychological and an individual level, because we think you lose out on the feeling of specialness when everything can just be produced en masse with no sort of effort whatsoever. In the status quo, you have a certain process of acquisition. You have a journey of, for instance, getting a product that makes you have a unique sort of attachment to that product. Maybe that product has sentimental value. Maybe it's unique. Maybe it's a famous piece of artwork that just should not be replicated willy-nilly because it was made by some famous painter that you just think there's immense value to that through scarcity. Obviously, though, this value and scarcity just doesn't apply when it comes to like basic survival needs, for instance, like food and water, etc. But we pointed out that's accounted for on either side of the house. What you get on their side is slews of material goods just arising out of oblivion. You create a colorless void in which no one really appreciates the things they do have in the world. Before I move on to the third and final harm that I want to point out in this argument, Vishwa, you can go ahead.
All right. So first of all, assuming that we can snap things into existence, I think it's also reasonable to assume that, look, we have a robust way of dealing with waste that isn't like what we do right now. Secondly, when you're talking about the scarcity of rare things like paintings or certain objects that are rare, they are still valuable because they're originals rather than the ones that were snapped into existence.
Right. Thank you for giving 2 POIs somehow in one. So the first thing about dealing with waste, obviously, you, for instance, have less scarcity in terms of landmass and you have more planets. That doesn't change the fact that on net, you just inject so much more waste into the world, especially because there's such a huge population. You cannot regulate how many people are just going to suddenly en masse produce so many things. But furthermore, our argument isn't just about originals. Like, I can have an Apple MacBook that isn't original right now. I still have an attachment to it because I actually went through a process of acquisition. You reduce that on your side. But the third thing is that on their side, they feed into the constant drive to keep replicating things, and therefore you feed into the hedonistic treadmill of consumerism in the first place. Because you keep placing this artificial value on materialistic goods, you tell everyone that because this machine is so great, it's presumably because of the fact that it can manufacture all these goods with you. So you create in the public perception this cultural obsession with just producing more and more and more materialistic goods to the point where society is just so preoccupied with continuing to indulge in consumerism. Therefore, it's still the people with access to this technology that are the happiest, that can keep compounding on their benefit that exists in the status quo. On all those grounds, it's a very clear ballot for the proposition. Thank you.
Thank you. We thank the speaker for that fine speech.